Hey fellow gliders, it's me, and today we're going to talk about all things RSVP, registering, checking in, things of that nature. And I see two ways that most people go about accomplishing this, and we're going to talk about both of those, and then that way you can make an educated decision as to which to apply for your app. But the premise is pretty simple. We have a list of things, and then we want our app users to dive into those things and either check in to those things or RSVP for those things or add themselves as a participant or a registered member or something like that, right? All right, so two basic ways to do this. I'm going to go about the most straightforward way, and then I'm going to show you a shortcut way. All right, so the easiest way to go about doing this is to create a new kind of log sheet, right? So we have in our backend here in the Glide Data Editor, we have a list of users, and then we have a list of places in this case. But again, these could be dates, these could be events, these could be courses, things of that nature. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a log. So I'm going to create a new table, and I'm going to call this, in my case, I have my people like check in, but I'll just do log to keep it generic. And now it's just about a matter of what information do you need to capture from your users. If it's just, hey, we have this person checking into this place, we're just looking for a count of people, well then really all you need is one thing. You need their email address maybe, or maybe you want to have a timestamp to go along with that, right? So I'm going to do two things. I'm going to do the email address and then a timestamp. And so for the name and description, we'll just delete those altogether. We don't need them for our purposes today. But again, all you're going to need is figure out which columns you want as part of your experience. Okay, so this is pretty straightforward then. I'm going to go ahead and dive into the place, and now we want to have a button for our users to check into the place, right? So I'm going to create a button component. I'm going to keep it simple, just keep it a very simple button, and we'll say something like check in, right? If this were an event, you could have them register for the event, right? If it were a course, we could have them register for the course. If it's some sort of, or if it's an event, you can have them RSVP for the event, something like that. But in my case, for these places, I just want to have my patrons check in to this place. And then basically it works almost like an analytics kind of thing too, because if I'm the owner of this place, I can have them figure out how many people are checking in to my place and when, based on the timestamp. And we're going to have this be very, very simple. All we're going to do is log the person who checked into the button, and then hide the button when we're done. So for this action, I'm going to do a new action, and we're going to do a simple thing of just add row. Now, I guess I did forget one thing here in our log. We need to figure out which place they're checking into. So I will do a place, and actually I'll do the place ID. I always like to use IDs rather than the actual name of the place, because if this place ever decides they want to change their name, it's going to throw off any relations that we do. But I do have a row ID already, so I'm going to send the row ID over rather than the name, and we'll use that as the identifier for that place. All right, back to our button. I'm going to come back over here, and we're going to create a new action on this button, and we're going to do a simple add row. Okay, we're not asking anything from our user. If we were asking them for like a comment or a rating or something like that, then instead of an add row, I would do a show form action. But instead, I'm just going to be a one-click check-in. So we're just going to do a simple add row, and we're going to add to the log, right? Which place are we talking about? That's the row ID of the place. The owner is going to be my email address. So it's whoever the user is that signed in. And the date will be the current date and time. Easy. And then I'm going to do a show notification to say you've checked in. If we wanted to, we could be fancy and go into the data editor and make this a template like you've checked into like Frankie's or something, but I'm going to keep it simple and not worry about template actions. And we'll just do check in. If we want to, we can play a sound for auditory notification too, and then save. All right, so it looks like this. So I push check in, And we've checked into the place. Great. Now the button is still showing here, right? I imagine that once you've checked into the place, you don't want them to push that button and spam that button multiple times. So here we have our log. We don't need this dummy first row, where we have the place ID, the owner, and the date. And now we want to hide the button if this owner has checked into this place. Now here's a little trick that you can do in order to make that button action kind of user specific. And I do this all of the time now in most of my apps. And it's all about creating a relation, right? We have to think about this backwards. So I'm in this place, I am the user, and I don't want to show this button anymore. Now we have to create some sort of condition here in our places table in order to make that happen. So I want to relate somehow this row ID to the log, and we have that. We can relate this row ID to the log, but I only want to relate it to me if I have checked into the place. So this is what's called a conditional relation. Glide doesn't have conditional relations quite yet. We have to create that condition first and then create the relations second. And so what I do is I create that condition first using an if then else column. And I usually name them something like if user then ID, just so I know what this is doing. I might even say like if current user then ID. And what I do is I say if the user, or sorry, if the owner, if the person that checked in is the signed in user, meaning it's me, well then I'll show the place ID. Else nothing. And so what this does is that if I'm signed in as anybody else, you see that the cell is blank because that person has not yet checked in. But if it's me, now I have this conditional ID here. And now what I can do is I can relate the place to that if then else column rather than to the place ID. And so there'll always be a relation if I've checked in to that place. All right, so I'm going to do a relation to current user log. And then this will be a relation where I'm going to match the row ID to the log if then else. And again, this will match the place to whether or not the current signed in user has checked in to that place. There we go. Done. Now, if we're doing something where you're going to allow them to check in like every day, well, then we could make this also a condition, something like this, right? If I'd have to do it backwards. I'd say something like if owner is not the signed in user, then nothing. And then if the date time is before today, then nothing, else owner, right? So now what that does is that if it's the next day, the 9th, or sorry, if so let's say today is the 8th and I checked in yesterday the 7th, okay, now we see that that's missing, right? And so because of that, the relation breaks, which then allows us to check in again. So if you wanted to have that be a recurring check-in, you can do that too, but with just some more if then else magic. Again, it's a conditional relation. We create the condition first and then the relation second. I'll leave it as is. That's fine. I'm going to allow this person to check in multiple times. Now, if you're RSVPing for an event, obviously you wouldn't want that. You get rid of the date and just have the one owner relation. Okay, so let's say it was yesterday I checked in, and now today I'm going to go ahead and check in. Great. So now I have 2 items in the log, right? And this is the most current. Then all I have to do is, if there's a relation, which currently there is, so if log current user is ID. I think I messed that up. I needed to have, I said email, but we don't want email, we want the ID. There we go. Cool, so now there's a relation. And now, whether it's empty or not empty, right? That's now my condition for the visibility for this button. And so I can hide the check-in to say if the current user log, I only want to show this button if that relation is empty, meaning I haven't yet checked in today. And now it's gone. And then I can do the reverse. I can show something else here and say, like, you've checked in, right? I can do a button, or I could do like a hint text, something like, you know, you checked in today. Check in again tomorrow. Right, and I want to show this if the current log is not empty. So if I'm anybody else, right, I can check in, but once I've checked in that day, it switches on me. Okay, so that's how we can go about creating a check-in system. Now, this was one way to go about doing it. And the benefit of doing it this way is that it's a lot more flexible, right? Because you can add in these different conditions, you can add in multiple criteria, you can capture their email and the date and a text and a rating and an emoji or whatever else you want from your patrons as part of that check-in process. Works really nicely for RSVPs, like you want RSVP yes or no, you know, things of that nature. Now, but if you only need to grab a count of one particular item, meaning I don't care about when they checked in and I don't care about a yes or no RSVP. I just want them to sign up for my course, or I just want them to check into my restaurant. And we don't need to have this log. I don't even need to see a history. I don't care about historic, like when people have checked in. I just want to see a count as to who's checked in. And if you have checked in, great, you should have access to my course or something, right? You actually don't need to do a log at all. And the benefit of that is that you don't have to worry about your row quota. As you see, I've already used 7 rows of my 500 of my free rows here, and I'm only one user. So if I'm checking into a place every day, right? Or even if there's like 15 things for me to check into, and I've checked into all of them, well, that's 15 rows. And if you have, 1,000 users, well, that's, 15,000 rows that you're using as your app, just for people checking in. And so if you want to mitigate that and keep your app really lean and not have to worry about a log at all, you can use some array magic to make this happen. You may have seen here as I was working, I have this patrons column. I'm going to leverage this. So instead of creating a log of people going down as rows, I want to create a list of users here in the patrons. And what this would ultimately look like is if I were to do a lookup, let's say, of this relation and grab the owner. Let's say this was a multiple. Okay. Ultimately, it would look something like this, where I have more than one user in this column, right? So if I were to have a second user in here, one at email.com, and let's say this person checked in as well. Cool. Right now we see that there's actually been, because I have row owners turned on, let me turn that off. Okay. Oh, you won't see it because I only have, because this is a conditional, but you would see that there's like more than one person in here if I were to do a relation to log it out of itself. Anyway, ultimately what we want is just everybody who's checked into the place to be inside of this patrons tab. All right, so here's how we can do that. All right, so the first thing is we want to ultimately have a comma-separated list of everybody who's checked in. In order to make that happen, we need to generate that comma-separated list, and then we'll do a set column to throw it in here. You may have seen some videos or If you are on my channel at all, or maybe you're on the forums and you've heard of the trebuchet method, this is like the trebuchet method, except we don't need to do any sort of complicated trebuchet stuff because Glide now released all of these array plugins, and that's what we're going to plan on using. All right, so the first thing we have to do is capture our email. So I'm going to say current user, and this will be a template column, and I just hit the triple dots, go to user profile, and grab my email, just like so. Done. Okay, next we're going to convert our email into an array, and to do that we create we use this array plugin, and we're going to find this single element array. So I'm turning my one thing into an array, and the value is going to be that current user. All right, so it looks like the exact same thing, right? Except this is not a true text column. This is an array column. So if I were to, I usually might call this like current user array. All right, so the difference here is, like, let's say I add a text field. You see the text field, I can add my current user, but I can't add current user array because you can't display an array in a text field or anything. You can't really display it. You can only use it in the data editor. All right, so the next thing we want to do is we want to merge our array with everybody else who's already checked in. So it's going to be whoever's in this patrons. Now we can't merge an array with a string. We can only merge an array with another array. So we have to convert whatever comma separated list here. Let's say it's like 1, 2, like this is first person, second person. We want to we turn this into an array. And so we can do that again with an array column. So with array, with a split text column. So we'll do a split text of our patrons, and we'll call this patrons array. Done. So basically we've converted our 1, 2 into an array where we have two values, 1 and 2. All right, so now we have our 1, 2, and we have our current user array, and now we can combine them together. And so we use an array, append array, and I usually call this append patrons. And I typically start with the current user array because that's always going to be in the sheet, and I'm appending the patrons. The reason why I don't do it the other way around is because if there hasn't been anybody to check in yet, let's say no one's checked into this yet, sometimes the things will be, yeah, as you see here, it's like it's blank, and I don't want a blank. I want something to be in here always. So that's why I do the other way around, where I start with the current user and then I append the patrons, like so. All right, so the last step is that button now. The button is not going to add a row anywhere. The button is going to take this new value, which has the current people who have checked in, 1, 2, and going to add me, right? So this is all 3 values. We're going to send this value to the current user patrons. We're going to replace the current patrons with myself included. But again, I can't replace a string value with an array value. I have to convert this array back to a string. And to do that, we use a join text. I would never find it. There's join list. And I usually call this like join append patrons. And I'm joining the texts in append patrons, and I'm going to separate them by a comma. Done. So again, I've converted this array into a string. You see it looks very similar to this, except it includes my email. Now, A lot of people would see this and say, okay, why don't you just take this value and add it to this value with a template column and be done with it? And the reason being is because sometimes we would have we have to deal with a comma when there's no existing patrons, right? I would have to create a template column called patrons, comma, current user. But I don't have to deal with a comma if there's nobody in here yet. So just using arrays, converting it to an array and back from array allows me to mitigate any sort of comma nonsense. Okay, so then now we can do the exact same thing that we did with adding to a log, except now we are just setting a column. All right, so let's go ahead and get rid of this condition. And let's get rid of, we'll keep this here. We'll get rid of this condition as well. And now this check-in button, instead of adding a row, we are going to do a set column. So do a set column values, and we are going to replace patrons with the join append patrons, like that. And then we'll still show a notification and play a sound. Great. Okay, just so you see the data happening here. These are the current list of people, 1, 2, but now I'm going to check in, and now it shows myself, 1, 2, right? And let's say this person's going to check in, right? Now we have this person, myself, 1, 2. So it just takes this value and replaces the patrons. So now we can do some conditions of showing this button based on whether or not our email address is part of patrons. Okay, so for this button, we had created a visibility relation when the relation was only when it was empty. Instead, we want to create the relation when patrons does not include my email, right? Because it does include my email, the button goes away. And same thing for this hint. We only want to show this when patrons includes the user email. All right. So if I were to create a brand new user, and dive back into our app and sign in as that user, okay? Because 2@email.com has not yet checked in and is thus not part of our patrons list. The button shows up. The moment we hit this button, it replaces our patron list with the existing patron list plus the current signed in user, which then means our email address now exists in patrons and the button goes away. Just like that. And so again, the benefit of doing it this way, yes, it's a little more complicated. You have some arrays and things like that, but you don't even need a use for a log whatsoever. I could delete my log sheet altogether, and I'm only worried about just this patrons field here. All right, now what if you are joining something and then want to remove yourself from the thing, right? If I was using a log, I could create an action that just deletes the row and be done with it, right? But with places, but with this field, I have to look at this array and remove myself from the array. And here's how we do that. We have another array column called remove element. And I'm going to remove, so the values are the append patrons, or sorry, I guess a patrons array, because I'm already part of this patrons array. And I'm going to remove me, the current user. I could have also chosen user profile email, but current user is already in there. Done. So you see that if I'm viewing as 2@email.com, 2 is no longer in here. And if I'm viewing as 1@email.com, well, now 1's no longer in here, and so forth. Right? It removes that value from the array. So I usually call this like remove patron array. or remove patron from array. Done. And then again, we have to create a join list. So we'll do a join list, and we'll call this remove, or join remove patrons. And we'll join the texts in the remove patron array. Okay, so in that case, if we wanted to remove ourselves, we would need some sort of action. So instead of using a hint text, I would use another button. Right, this button would be like remove check-in. And this would show up when patrons, again, includes myself. I probably changed the visibility of this. And then the action is a set column value still, but we're not using the join append patrons for the patrons. We are going to use the join remove patrons join list instead. And then the notification would be like, you've checked out, or you've removed your check-in. Save. And so I could remove my check-in if I'm viewing as myself. I remove my check-in. So now my email is no longer in the patrons, which allows me to check in again. Cool, right? And again, this has nothing to do with our log. It's all about places. So again, it keeps the app lean. The only consideration is that you can only track one thing, right? So in this case, all the magic is happening with this one patrons column, and the only thing I'm tracking in that patrons column is my email address. I can't track when I push the button. I can't add a rating. I can't track my location or anything like that. It's just a raw value, and allows me to use that raw value to determine if I've checked into that place. Right. The last thing I want to show you that you can do here is grab a count as to how many people have checked in. If you're using the log, you'll leverage a relation. If you're using the patrons, you'll leverage the array. So here I'm going to, if we're doing the log, I'll create like a relation to log, and I'll relate the row ID to the log place ID, because I want to grab everybody whether or not they're mine. So I wouldn't use this one, I'll use all of them. Match multiple. Okay. All right, so then I could do a single value, I roll up and grab a count of patrons, and I can summarize the value of the relation to log and grab all of the different email addresses that are in there. And you see I have a count of 3. Okay, because in my relation to my log, I have 3 things, 1, 2, and 3, which are these 3 things right here. Now, in my patrons, in my patrons here, I also have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I have 5 people, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so I can also do a count if I wanted to grab, a count of the patrons. If I'm using the arrays, I do the same thing. I grab the rollup, and instead of summarizing the value of the relation, I can summarize the values of the patrons array that I created. And you see if I use that, now I have 5. Okay. The only consideration is that if no one's checked in yet, you're not going to have anything. They'll be blank here. So the only way around that would be to create a relation to yourself. Right, create a relation, but create a relation from the patrons array back to the users, and then do a roll up on that relation. But not a big deal. And so now we have, we can create a template column here, make this look pretty. We can call this count patrons display, and we'll do a template where we can say number people checked in, where number is the count of the patrons. Now, also, if you want to get picky, if we wouldn't say one people checked in, you'd say one person. So you'd probably create an if then else too. I call it like person or people. And you do an if then else, and you say if the count equals 1, then person, else people. Right, and then you can, instead of using people, you can put a capital P in there and replace that P with your variable. And so if I only had one person check in this way, right, and my rollup was off of the relation, right, I say it's one person checked in versus 0 people checked in. And then you can display this wherever you'd like. You know, you can have it here on the details screen, or you can have it as a tag on the tile. Something like that, you know, make it look pretty. All right, so hopefully this is very instructive, and hopefully now you have a better sense as to which route you should go if you want to mess with arrays or you want to do a log. Again, just to recap, log is very dynamic and flexible, but it will eat into your row quota here versus the arrays, which doesn't eat into your row quota whatsoever. It's just however many places you have, that's how many rows you're going to use, but you can only track one thing and get just a total count at the end. All right, if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave me a comment below or reach out to me at Twitter at @rpetito, and as always, thanks for watching.